Okay, so first of all, I want to thank you for sharing with my class comparative education. Over the course of the semester, we've been examining different educational systems around the world. Early on in the semester, some of the learners in my class expressed an interest in education in the UAE and how those kinds of things operate. And I know that your frame is more from a higher ed perspective, but I think particularly because you worked some with undergraduates there, it'd be really interesting to hear about how you saw connections to kind of primary and secondary education before those students arrived on campus, and what kind of things you feel like you may have gleaned from your experience with those students and their preparation for higher education, in comparison with, maybe some of the things that you experience here in the States, having been in both contexts and worked with students in both contexts.
So I want to provide a little bit more of a framework of how things were set up at the institution that I worked at. So I was at Zayed University, and it is a public federal institution. So we do end up seeing a lot of the Emirati students kind of coming into our system. With that being said, Zayed University is very much set up like an American higher ed institution, in that they not only have accreditation in the UAE, but they also have accreditation in the US as well with middle states. So I think part of what I was seeing too was like the adjustment of students to a more of an American model of higher education. With the students, I primarily worked with first year and second year learners, and what we noticed a lot of, and I think this can be applied kind of across the board, just kind of that transition piece, a little bit of struggle with transitioning from secondary to post-secondary education. And kind of building on that, our students seem to struggle a lot with moving from rote memorization, which is a lot of what they had to do to successfully complete their secondary education, moving into more frames of critical thinking and trying to engage different content that's presented to them in the class from that lens. And then also just understanding kind of the purpose of higher education in terms of how it was going to affect their lives, whether positively or negatively, just depending. And I think that's also indicative of the culture of the UAE as well, when a lot of times their advancement after they've completed education has more so to do with their social networks and their familial relationships than it necessarily does with a particular degree that they're earning at the institution. So as faculty and staff at Zayed University, we had to work really closely with the students to help them kind of navigate those differences.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting, the piece that you mentioned around the model of the university, because another thing that we've been talking about in our class is the impact of globalization on education around the world, and this idea of, the world is shrinking and the models of education really are starting to look quite similar, as folks are rushing to what is oftentimes a kind of more westernized approach to education. So it sounds like certainly some of that was felt there at Zayed and in the UAE. The other part of it is that I'd be interested in having you explore a little bit more around kind of the purposes of education as you understood them to be in the UAE, and particularly at Zayed, when you were talking about work and its connection to like familial connections and what was waiting on the other side. So one of the things we've been talking about in class is the kind of neoliberalization of education as well, and how it really has become this thing that is much more of a commodity than it is something for, the public good. And did you see any of that influence or impact on education there in the UAE?
Yes, definitely. I would say so. The whole understanding of it as a commodity is very much the framework that we were working within. And I say that because the UAE is a very young country, comparatively speaking to other nations. And a lot of what they're trying to do as a country is position themselves as a global power. And so, with that, they've identified things that they want to see in their citizens. And part of that is education. And that's one of the reasons why education is free for Emiratis within the country that attend like public institutions. Um, and so with that being identified as something that they want to see in their citizens, it's almost like, okay, here's a list of things that you need to have to be productive in the society. But it is, like I said, it's not necessarily focused on, I guess, the content of the degree as much so as the degree itself. That's more valuable. And you often see students finishing and going into a variety of sectors within the government because that's the kind of the go-to. Not many actually want to work in the private sector, but all they need is a degree to work in whatever area, because then it becomes more of an apprenticeship. And that's when they really start to learn like trades and certain knowledge and skills that they need to be successful in those areas. But again, the ticket or the gateway is to have that degree first. There are, I would definitely say, there are some institutions that focus on helping students to improve like knowledge development. But you see that a little bit more in the private sector. From some of those institutions than some of the public institutions. And that's really because we get handed down mandates from the government in terms of what needs to be done and how many students need to complete and different things like that.
From your experience, would you say that government mandates had more of an impact on post-secondary education there at the UAE than they did on secondary education, or the reverse, or about the same?
I would argue about the same. So one of the things that as a part of the structure of the secondary education system is that students end up testing, and I can't remember exactly which grade they end up testing, but based on the results of those tests, they end up in a particular track. So they may end up in a science track or more of a humanities track. And that really either opens up opportunities for them or limits opportunities in terms of higher education. And so you see like the mandates in effect playing out with that particular portion. And then in terms of the post-secondary, again, like how we're shaping the curriculum, that all comes from the top down, and then to other types of programs that are available to students. So even though there's this notion of like the Western model of higher education is more so in providing, I guess, comprehensive student services and student support services than anything mostly like in academic affairs.
Yeah. So I'd be interested from your perspective to hear, obviously, as you mentioned, the context of Zayed is that it was modeled on, kind of US post-secondary education. From your time there and working with the students and within that educational context, do you think that there are things that were done in the UAE that could be beneficial for folks working in the States to consider as it pertains to education?
So one thing that I think Zayed University does really well has a lot to do with how they're advising students throughout the process. So they've had a couple of models in the past, but the model that they're currently using really allows for the learners to connect with a specific advisor, and that advisor is staying with them throughout their journey at the institution. And so that relationship that the advisor is able to build with the student really helps them to kind of inform their thinking and understanding about what they could do, like beyond the institution once they finish their degree. Because I think that's the other piece too, that is more of a big push, because they don't necessarily get a lot of that in the secondary system, like what they can do and how they can kind of move beyond what even their families are saying, or what the community is dictating that they do. But I mean, that's a very fine line, because the family is so important and so integral to kind of their identity and their development within a system. But I think the relationships that are built within the model as it presents as IED is a key, like is a key ingredient to the success of the students.
Absolutely. And with the advisors that they encounter in post-secondary ed, so I'm trying to see if I can make some connections here or if they exist at all. So certainly let me know if the connections are there. But you had mentioned this idea that a lot of the students in the UAE go through this testing process, and that kind of determines what their, career track may be moving forward into post-secondary education. Are there opportunities for students who say tested in a science track to pursue humanities, or vice versa, someone who tested in a humanities track to pursue sciences? Or is it pretty set that that is the way that they will have to go once they get to post-secondary education?
So my answer to that is, I guess, is kind of yes and no. So for the bachelor's degree, it is very much set which institutions they can apply to. So one of the things that the UAE is trying to do is, with the public institutions, have them provide academic programs that fall within a particular lane. And so it's not the same programs offered at all the institutions. And whether or not a student can apply to a program very much depends on what track they were in secondary. But when it comes to post-baccalaureate degrees and opportunities, the field is wide open to them. And so oftentimes you'll see students completing their bachelor's degree based on whatever track they were part of in secondary, and having this desire to move beyond that. And then they pick that up with either a certificate program or a master's degree.
Okay.
And that also is the time too when they have opportunities to study outside of the UAE as well.
Okay. So I would imagine then that the advisor is pretty instrumental in helping them navigate what those experiences might look like beyond the bachelor's degree.
Yeah, definitely that is one of the major components in terms of kind of sharing information and building that knowledge that the student has. Another thing too that the institution does, and I would argue most of the public institutions do really well, and this again goes back to kind of the bigger initiative of the country and being kind of at the forefront, or at least being one of the major players, is build up the students' cultural understandings, because most of the federal institutions are very homogenous in the sense that it's primarily Emirati students that are attending them. And you may end up with some students from the surrounding Gulf countries. But with that being said, these institutions have also been really intentional and diligent with creating memorandums of agreement and exchange programs and study abroad opportunities for students. So they're still trying to expose them to, I guess, like a breadth of knowledge and information and cultures outside of the UAE in an effort to benefit the country in of itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so I'm interested to hear, again, from your perspective, where you feel there might have been issues in taking a Western, particularly kind of Americanized approach to higher education in the context of the UAE.
I would argue that one of the biggest things, especially for Zaya University, has to do with how it was founded. So yes, there's a Western model, but I think one of the challenges or maybe deficiencies has to do with there were Westerners that came in to do that. And it wasn't necessarily a true partnership with Westerners and Emiratis. So a lack of understanding about culture and how that translates to students' experiences, I think was kind of a challenge in the beginning, but the shift is happening with initiatives similar to like Emiratization, where they're striving to put in key leadership positions individuals either from the Gulf region or from the Emirati population. And so because that shift is happening, then some of the cultural norms and things that make students feel comfortable in the learning environment are really starting to come into play at the institution. And you see more of a emergence together between Western culture and then Emirati culture. And I think that's having a positive effect on the students.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are two other areas that I want to explore with you before we end our conversation. And so a big theme of our semester has been looking at educational inequalities and the way that those things play out in different places, both here in the States and other places, and particularly looking at poverty and gender parity. And so I guess I'll ask you first about this idea of poverty, because I think one of the things that, like, usually for many folks here in the States, if they don't know anything about the UAE, they know that it is a relatively rich country, right? Um, but I'm curious to hear your about your knowledge and perspective around folks who might be in poverty in the UAE and what that means for them educationally.
So the UAE consists of 7 emirates, and I was in Abu Dhabi, and the university that I worked at also had a campus in Dubai. And those 2 emirates are the richest emirates. With that being said, a lot of the students that I encountered and worked with were not, they didn't necessarily meet that in terms of poverty. Their families were well above that in terms of means and resources that are available to them. So I didn't interact with them with that part of the population in that regard in my classroom. However, with that being said, I visited the other Emirates and very much saw kind of what was happening with those that aren't as publicized, I guess, from the country. The thing about the education, though, is that it's still free regardless for all students, which I think kind of helps with that. In terms of gender, the institution started out as female only to kind of, I guess, address some of that they were noticing or seeing with institutions that are started before women not necessarily feeling comfortable in certain spaces, because still very much so the population is separated along by binary, by male and female. And women needed a place, kind of like their own educational institution in order to feel comfortable. And one of the things that I've noticed is that we have students across generations. And so you'll see mothers returning because that education is still free and open to them. So mothers that have gotten their kids out and some of their kids may actually be at Zayed. And so like they're going to class with their adult daughter. And then you also see like more traditional aged college students as well, like in the environment. But Zayed was the only female institution for a while, and it has since opened its doors to male students, but again, it's still very much separate. So there is a female campus, and then there's a male campus. So the females have a place where they feel comfortable and again, kind of safe to explore that side of themselves in terms of how they're growing and changing. In each emirate, there is a public institution, because again, that is how the students have, or Emiratis have an opportunity to access like free education. And there are a lot of subsidies that the government does give out to all citizens, which does help. But again, you can see like a difference in terms of richness and wealth attributed to different families over others. And a lot of this stems from kind of the tribes that were around before they decided to become, you know, a country and then separate into the Emirates themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you say that opportunities for women, because I think it's interesting, you know, you talk about Zayed was the only university that was focused on women's education primarily. Um, but so I would imagine that there might be more women who could be or might be desirous of in being engaged in particularly post-secondary education who might not be. And I could be wrong there, so certainly correct me around that. But I'm also curious to know, does the experience of having post-secondary education translate on the other side of it in terms of the kind of career and opportunities that women have in the UAE?
Um, I would definitely argue yes, that it does translate on the other side. Because again, really what happens after you finish goes back to that network. And as long as their family has a tie to an area that they're interested in, most likely they're going to get an opportunity to work in that field. And so you see women at varying levels, like within the government, because that is the primary employer of Emiratis. And one of the initiatives that's now coming out of the country, and so it's being played out not only in post-secondary but also secondary, is this notion of entrepreneurship and innovation. And so usually at the beginning of each year, like calendar year, the leaders of the different emirates will identify like specific themes or kind of areas of focus, and those initiatives will pop up from both levels of education so that students are focusing on developing in those pieces. So with the entrepreneurship, I'm gonna say maybe like 2 years ago, it was the year of entrepreneurship. So you saw like different competitions and different opportunities for individuals to come together and kind of exercise their understanding of that and create opportunities for themselves that could then be funded by various organizations within the government. So yeah, it's a definite push for that and a push for more women entrepreneurs too within the UAE.
Okay. Yeah. My last question then for you is what advice might you have to offer to folks who might think about moving into, and this may go a little bit beyond the UAE because I know that you've worked in other places in the world as well as visited other places and kind of observed their educational processes. But what advice might you give to someone who might be thinking that they would like to explore opportunities, career opportunities, working in education abroad?
One of I guess the pieces that I could offer has to do with mindset. Um, I cannot stress enough how important it is to have an open mindset without some sort of ulterior motive. Because one of the key things is that I found in working in other countries has to do with how people take pride in their own culture and their communities. And so being open to that and truly trying to understand that culture, how they approach education is paramount, and not trying to push any sort of like westernized agenda when you're walking into those environments, and recognizing too that there are people there that have their own vision for how they want to evolve the educational system. And really your job is to support that. And kind of keeping that in mind, and then just, you know, building your network so you begin to explore how maybe their understanding or their notion of education is situated within like kind of the global context, and then starting to identify different similarities, common things that as it relates to your own experience of education and how you've practiced education in the past, and drawing from that as you start to engage like the learners in those environments.
Oh, well, thank you, Dr. Smith, for sharing that. I think you really hit on an interesting point there with your last, kind of the last perspective you shared, where we have been talking about in our class this kind of idea of ethnocentrism and
Mm,
how it can be dangerous in how we think about comparative education. And we really have to examine what our lenses are when we think about systems, other places, and where we may get caught up in thinking of, a US perspective or a Western perspective as like the right perspective or the end all be all perspective. And there's a lot to be learned from, like you said, being open. Uh,
mhm.
so thank you again for your time.
Thank you.
Very valuable and made a lot of connections across things that we've been talking about over the course of the semester. So we really appreciate you lending your voice to this.
You're welcome.
Okay.